In the past weeks, we've looked at the seven valleys, and we've taken about a week to go through each of the valleys. And this week, we will start looking at a few of the other shorter works and tablets that have been added to this volume, which we will see add, I think, tremendously to the concept of spiritual journey, in some ways going beyond the seven valleys, and other ways coming back to and looking at the same kind of territory of the seven valleys, but through a different lens. But before getting into the text of these works themselves, I wanted to come back to a theme that has been with us since the beginning of our walk through this volume, and that is asking the question of what Baha'u'llah's purpose is in this volume, apart from it being seen as a manual for the personal mystical quest. We can also see the works in this volume and more generally the Baha'u'llah's purpose, both in this early period of his ministry, as well as more explicitly in the later period of his ministry, to establish certain theological foundations which will be required for accomplishing his ultimate aim, which is the coming together of the human race, which is the production of unity in the world. And Baha'u'llah does that through these volumes, I think, by opening up the concept of truth, of spiritual reality, of spiritual journey, and turning it from something which can be interpreted as very narrow, very exclusive, there being only one correct way of looking at things, a way that is encapsulated in perhaps a doctrine or a catechism. And Baha'u'llah opens up the entire field in the discussion of spiritual reality by telling us that people tread spiritual paths which on the surface can be very different from each other, can even be just contradictory with each other. And Baha'u'llah describes these various spiritual paths to us. And perhaps we resonate with one or more of these. Perhaps we feel like we've had some personal or intimate experience with some of the journeys that he's describing. But what Baha'u'llah tells us time and time again in the course of these works is that each spiritual path is true from the perspective of the seeker. And this idea of the universality of the spiritual experience, which is expressed in various forms, like light shining through lamps, and the lamp glasses are different colors, and so you have this incredible diversity of color, but the light shining within it is the same. Baha'u'llah gives us this image of the spiritual journey, which opens us up to imagining a world which can be unified spiritually, which can become one united and connected spiritual community. But before that can happen, we have to be able to transcend our limited perspectives that see our interpretation as correct and all other interpretations as wrong. And what Baha'u'llah is doing in these mystical works is allowing us to look outside the realm of our own personal experience, that which we may personally resonate with, and to see that there is truth to be found in these other perspectives. Now, one can immediately take that idea and say, well, isn't this a bit of a dangerous idea? Isn't there a possibility that this broadening of our discourse, this broadening of our field of vision when it comes to our understanding of the human spiritual experience, is there a danger that can lead to a sort of an anything goes? Well, if to go from one extreme to the other, from the one extreme of saying there's only one correct way of looking at the world and there's only one correct interpretation, from the opposite extreme, which is, well, there is no truth that any of us have any reasonable access to, and so whatever you believe is fine. And Baha'u'llah is not I think, asking us to land on either of these extremes. He is he is enumerating for us various spiritual paths, which are the means by which we navigate the world. But there's not an infinite number of them. They're not. So in that sense, it's not an anything goes kind of world where any idea that people have is equally correct. And maybe a good metaphor that can be used to think about this is the metaphor of a map, because a spiritual journey or a spiritual path, it's the means by which we navigate the world. It's like a map. It gets us to our destination. And it's like Baha'u'llah is asking us not to be too stuck on the fact that different people are using different maps to navigate this world. For example, the map that perhaps we initially think of when we think of a map of the world is the political map of the world, where this three-dimensional surface of the globe is spread out in two dimensions, which already creates a certain degree of distortion. And onto the continents and the land masses, we then put these lines which would delineate the boundaries, between one country and another country. And it's funny that this map of the world is entirely a product of human invention. These lines are imaginary. They exist in our heads. They exist in a very kind of abstract sense. But in a way, this is the most important or the most practically useful map that we have to navigate the world. It's the one that is, let's say, the furthest removed from the reality itself, but it's the one that is the most practically useful for us. It determines where you can and can't go. You can't do without that map if you want to navigate the world today. But there's another kind of map. There's many other kinds of maps of the world. You can imagine, and we've all seen topological maps of the world that shows contours of the high and low places, which gives a sense of the surface of the Earth from a different perspective. This contour map gives you a sense of the wholeness of things, absent all of the political boundaries. You come away with a different intuition of the shape of the surface of the Earth. It's almost as though the political map is like the first three valleys, the valleys of distinction, where you take one thing and you carve it up into the different bits, and you see it through the lens of these different bits, these political entities. And the topological map is like the valley of unity and the valleys beyond, where you can see the entire surface of the planet as one whole, instead of divided up into pieces. And perhaps this is part of why it was so important and such a profound moment for humanity collectively when a few decades ago the first astronauts landed on the moon, and one of the things they did was turn the camera back to take a picture of the Earth from a distance in its entirety for the first time. And obviously there are no political boundaries visible there, but being able to see the Earth in its entirety provides us with a radically different perspective, which we knew intellectually was there, but until we saw it, it didn't have that same kind of an impact. But seeing the surface of the Earth through the lens of a political map versus through the lens of a topological map is one way of thinking of how there are different spiritual journeys and they're each is correct within its particular way of looking at things. But there's not an infinite number of correct maps that you can draw. I mean, you can't just take a blank sheet of paper and draw continents any which way you want and draw boundaries or draw whatever. There's only a limited subset of correct ways of conveying information about the surface of the planet. Of course, there are many more than just these two. There's you could have a map of tectonic plates, which it gives you even sort of a level below. It gives you additional insights and information that you might not have had below. If you see a map of the tectonic plates, then you have some understanding of how the continents, which are there on the surface, came to exist. You can understand the motion of things and how things how things have moved over time, how the east coast of South America strangely resembles the west coast of Africa, and so forth. So, that kind of map would not reveal anything about the political reality of the world, but it would reveal some deeper reality about which can help explain the realities that lie on the surface. One can also think of maps of ocean currents and air currents, average temperatures, and so forth. I mean, dozens of maps that one can imagine, but certainly not an infinite number of maps. One finally can think of abstracting even beyond the idea of a two-dimensional map. One can think of the mathematical laws of physics themselves as being an even more abstract map, in a sense, that these laws determine how the planet forms in the first place. How the crust of the Earth cools out of the primordial elements from the initial hot state in its coming together with the creation of the solar system. But that's an extremely abstract way of getting at an understanding of the surface of the Earth. But what I'm suggesting is that there are a series of ways of understanding our physical world, beginning with those which are purely a contingent reality, the reality of our political divisions, and sort of going backwards to the most abstract possible ways of explaining and describing how and what the surface of the Earth is.
And we need a street map to get us where we want to go in our particular journey.
That's right. And the street maps that we've used throughout history are the religions of the world. The religions of the world are like maps for parts of the Earth. And historically, the different religions of the world have not been universal. They have been specific to particular time and place, to particular cultures, to certainly within confined to certain, at least initially, to certain continents or certain peoples, and those maps were sufficient to help navigate the spaces within the terrain, the spiritual terrain that existed at that time. But another aspect of maps is that they can get out of date, because the surface of the Earth is not a static thing. The surface of the Earth is dynamic. It's constantly changing. If we see if we understand plate tectonics, we understand how the continents are moving on the time scales of millions of years or tens of millions of years. And so a map that may be quite correct at one moment in time can become gradually more and more distorted and less useful as time goes on. There are very particular maps that we use, at the level of the cities, at the level of particular regions, which we have very ancient versions of. I'm thinking of what's called the Madaba map, which was the tile floor of an old church in Jordan, a village in Jordan. It was discovered a century or two ago. But the map dates back to the 7th century, the 600s, and it was a map, a very intricate mosaic map of the Holy Land. And it shows the location of cities as they existed then, and the centerpiece of this map is the city of Jerusalem, which it shows as this big oval, and it shows, and it's a mosaic map, so it's a tile map, so it doesn't have that much resolution, but it does the most you could possibly do with these small tiles. Every tile has a meaning. It indicates this or that church or this or that street. It exposes some of the ancient streets of the city of Jerusalem, which don't exist at all today. But as the archaeologists, gradually excavated underneath the streets of Jerusalem, they uncovered these structures, which were visible in this map on the floor of this old church in Jordan that no one had any idea it existed. But one would never want to use this mosaic floor map to navigate the streets of Jerusalem today. I mean, you can't get through the twisting and turning streets of the old city by reference to the Madaba map. As much as you may reverence that map, as much as you may treasure that map, as much as as you may, as that map may unlock for you some understanding of how people saw the world back then, of what was important to them, of what things existed back then. Nevertheless, it no longer serves as the best tool for navigation of the current reality. The religions of today are the Madaba maps. You know, they all had in their time gave us a reasonably accurate picture of the terrain that they were meant to describe. But as all maps do, these maps have become out of joint with the realities of the day. They still inspire, they're still venerated, but they're no longer useful in navigating the twisting and turning streets of the modern world and modern realities. And so there's a need to refresh these maps from time to time and bring them up to date. In doing so, we're never throwing away the old maps, but we understand everything within its context. We understand how truths are relative, not just in space but in time. The truths, the relative truths that Baha'u'llah is discussing in the Call of the Divine Beloved, largely are the truths which are relative in space, by which I mean truths which are relative from one person to another, from one culture to another, describing these different lenses that we can see the world through. The lens of distinction, the lens of unity being perhaps the most important. But beyond the Call of the Divine Beloved, in the larger context, there are also the relativities of time that our picture of ultimate truth is an evolving picture, and if it doesn't evolve with us, then it becomes less and less useful, and at some point, it actually becomes counterproductive to its initial purpose. But if we understand this evolutionary component, we can see everything within its context and understand the relative truths of things. As one, I think, particular example relevant to the conversation of the present day, we're looking at one of the great challenges facing the world is the challenge of tribalism, the challenge of people who have a very limited view of their identity, which is defined on more of a micro scale, defined by religion, by race, by nationality, and other forms of self-identification. And we can understand the tribal identity as something which, in its time, represented an advance over human identity, which is entirely confined to self. Relative to an existence in which one values self over everything, to value one's family or one's tribe as something which is valuable in its own right over the self is a great advance. It represents a step forward in the evolution of human consciousness. But when the technological advances make it possible for humans to traverse oceans and to come in contact with other cultures, to travel large distances easily, to communicate with others instantaneously, suddenly our tendency to see ourselves and identify ourselves at the tribal level becomes limiting. And while that was something which in its time, centuries or thousands of years ago, was an advance in human consciousness, in relation to the particular exigencies of today and the needs of today, continuing to have a tribal perspective on things is not just limiting, but it's now in the way of the larger progress that inevitably has to happen, the larger movement of the world coming together into a single tribe, the planet coming together and becoming united politically, economically, culturally, and spiritually. And so it's from this perspective, I think that that Baha'u'llah is inviting us to in the Seven Valleys, that we can extrapolate this idea of the relative truths of the different stages in the spiritual path to see how people are so at odds with each other today in the political realm, and have some understanding for it. Understand that, you know, how people look at the world is there's truth to it within their own perspective, but there may be pragmatic and larger forces of history that it's better to be aligned with, because this is the direction that humanity is moving in.
Heretofore, that the feeling of superiority of one culture over another, one tribe over another, has been a great detriment to learning from each other. And
yes, it's been an enormous detriment.
But we actually, at that level of maturity, achieved more by doing it that way than losing. We gained more from the internal unity of the tribe than we did from the loss of what we would, the opportunity, what economists would call the opportunity cost, what we gave away from doing that. We still gained more based on our level of maturity at that time.
So
Yeah, Brooke.
my question is then, how do we achieve a balance between the essence of tribal identity that has been for so long and has been so maligned and mistreated for so long, and the coming together in the way that we wish to spiritually as the oneness of humanity and the oneness of spirituality, without losing a sense of self? Because even in what we call more advanced civilizations, I mean, we have been raised from the time we were born with expectations and rules and regulations put upon us with the best of intentions that we don't call tribal, but they're class-based, or they are nationally connected, identified. And the essence of who an individual is as a human being and as a spiritual being in a human body often is not discovered early in life because of these things. And yet there are things about tribalism and about traditional ways that we don't want to lose a sense of. So how do we achieve that?
That's a great challenge. There's no, I think, formula that one could easily cite, you know, to get to that point. But the imagery that Baha'u'llah gives us is the imagery of the human body, that humanity can be seen as, in that sense, it's not just a big mass of undifferentiated cells that have come together in unity, but it retains the distinctive character of its parts. And just as in the human body, you know, the different organs and parts of the body are all functioning with this degree of coherence, and everything is supporting everything else fundamentally. Nevertheless, the different parts of the body retain their unique identity, and the body would in fact die if that weren't the case. I think it's that kind of image that we want to achieve. How we achieve it is the problem of the day. You know, that's the question of the hour. You know, and that's the question that we're actively dealing with in the political realm, because, you know, we have these forces of globalization which are impinging upon certain more local identities, and creating, you know, and there's winners and losers at the local level when civilization becomes more global in its scope.
And this metaphor sounds wonderful in its application, but it's also limited to physical aspects, because the human body is physical. So we're talking about form here. And what we're talking about when it comes to spiritual evolution is formless. So how do we include those aspects of spirituality and group identity that's not based on form in as the evolution as we evolve?
Baha'u'llah gave us the overall model in answer to that question in the long obligatory prayer, in which he says, I have come to unite the B and the E. The B is the body, the E is the formless spirit. They are to be united together, not chosen between or given one over the other is more important. They are to be united and knit together in the language of the long obligatory prayer. Now that's not an answer in the sense of now we know what to do, we're all set. But that is what we must always keep in mind as the goal, as the where we're headed for this dispensation and where humanity is headed, despite all the confusions of the moment, which are many.
To bring it back to the text at hand, the different valleys, these different stages of the seeker, are analogous to these different organs. They're you're asking, well, in the physical body, they're you have physical organs. So what's the analogy in the spiritual realm? You have those in the valley of search, and some in the valley of love, and some in the valley of knowledge. Those are the organs of the spiritual body of the human race. Each has its role to play. Each has a function within in the operation of the body as a whole. Baha'u'llah let's look at the first of the extra tablets, of the new tablets, and this is the tablet number 3 from the letter Ba to the letter Ha. We know who the Ba is, but we don't know who the Ha is. So presumably this is someone whose name begins with the letter H. A lot of possibilities. Baha'u'llah refers in the opening paragraph to the fact that he had previously written to this person a tablet in Arabic, and now he's writing it in Persian. But I don't believe it's been identified yet who this person is. What is interesting to me about this tablet is that I think of this short tablet as an advanced spiritual text. Beyond the 7 valleys, it's almost as though the 7 valleys is assumed, the knowledge of that and the end point of it, and Baha'u'llah describes different possibilities for the endpoint in this tablet. I won't, just from constraints of time, read the entire text of them, but just point out particular aspects and a few particular passages. In the opening paragraph of this tablet, Baha'u'llah he says something interesting about making certain attainments without moving. Perchance, he says, thou mayest become pure spirit, attain without taking a single step the loftiest stations of mystical ascent, and explore without leaving thine outward habitation the furthermost reaches of the worlds of inner significance. Thereupon wouldst thou with a divine rapture experience true spiritual attraction, lay down thy life in the path of the friend, and sacrifice thy soul in the wilderness of his love. This indeed is the meaning of stillness in flight, and flight in stillness, of fluidity in solidity, and solidity in fluidity. What is he referring to here? Apparently the question that was asked of Baha'u'llah, which has not survived, had something to do with this. Someone was asking Baha'u'llah, what do these two things mean? It's possible that they were referring to previous works of Baha'u'llah where these phrases occur. So for example, this stillness in flight and flight in stillness is actually found in Gleanings number 82, where someone had asked about the human soul, and Baha'u'llah said, it is still, and yet it soareth, it moveth, and yet it is still. And looking back at the original, there's this Toyere Sa Ken and Sa Ken Toyer, the same phrase appears in this tablet in Gleanings. So I'm not sure of the dating of that tablet in Gleanings, but it may be that someone is asking for clarification on what do you mean by this? It's still and yet it moves and yet it's still. And then in the next half of the sentence, of fluidity and solidity in fluidity, Jariye Mon Jamad, there's a prayer in Prayers and Meditations by Baha'u'llah, number 38, in which this curious sentence appears: "I bear witness that in his person solidity and fluidity have been joined and combined." And looking back at the original Arabic, which literally says, "Verily, he has frozen fluidity and fluid fixity." It's exactly the same words. And so the questioner may have seen this prayer, assuming the prayer was revealed earlier, and was asking Baha'u'llah what he meant by this. But he goes on to say that, and this is the real heart of the tablet. He gives us three different stages, which are really almost further to the paradigm of the seven valleys. He gives us three further perspectives. He says, "It is clear that the wayfarers in the wilderness of search and longing, of attainment and reunion, have numerous degrees and countless stations. Some, after spiritual struggle and physical toil, ascend from the lower reaches of 'no God is there' to the lofty bowers of 'but God,' flee from the shadow of negation to abide in the limitless realm of affirmation, and abandon the privation of a transient existence for the bountiful assemblage of reunion. This is the uttermost limit of the realm of effort and striving." And in this paragraph, Baha'u'llah seems to be summarizing the essential, let's say, paradigm of the seven valleys. That is, that one ascends from the lower reaches of 'no God is there', from the law to the lofty bowers of 'but God', to the illah. And this is, as I think we talked about in a previous session, an allusion to the famous affirmation of faith of the Muslims, the Shahada, La ilaha illallah wa Muhammadun Rasulullah. No God is there but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. And the first part of that Shahada is La ilaha illallah. No God is there but God. And the mystics have spent a great deal of time parsing this and noting that it begins with a la. It begins with the word no. No God is there, illallah, but God. So the letter of negation precedes the letter of affirmation. One has to dispense with that which is false before one has to empty one's cup of the cup of self before one can fill that cup again with the cup of life, of life in God. And this is and in the seven valleys, the very uttermost limit, the end point of the seven valleys, is the valley of true poverty and absolute nothingness, which is that valley of emptying out the cup. And the way Baha'u'llah describes it in the seven valleys, that seventh valley of true poverty and absolute nothingness, he kind of joins fana and baga in that valley. He joins the emptiness or annihilation with eternal life, and says that final valley is the valley of the death of the self and the life in God, and they come together as one idea at the end of the seven valleys. But elsewhere, both in Gems of Divine Mysteries and as we'll see in these tablets, he separates them more and discusses them more as different stages. But what he does here in this tablet, yes, so fana is the stage of true poverty and absolute nothingness.
So he's talking about the different stages to get to the.
Yeah, so in this paragraph, he's saying some traverse these various degrees, to get through the la to the illah. In other words, they traverse various stages to go to get to fana, to get to annihilation as the prerequisite to the emptying of the cup, as a prerequisite to refilling it with the water of life. The second birth. The baptism of the Spirit.
Walking a different path and occupying different rank is the definition of diversity.
Sure,
because
absolutely.
Each person,
yes.
each individual, really, down to the individual level, is going to find a different path.
That's right.
There just isn't going to be even a set of paths that
That's right.
everyone will
That's
do.
right.
So this makes diversity an essential feature. It's not just a nice
Absolutely.
thing.
That's right.
We're supposed to, many Baha'is talk about diversity as wonderful to have diversity. But really, it's inculcated and built into the essence of reality. It's not an option.
That's right.
It's a mandatory thing.
Yes. And the second, and the second stage then, The other alternative Baha'u'llah gives is in paragraph 3. He says, others, without receiving the least intimation of no God is there, pass beyond the highest horizon of but God, without even tasting a dewdrop of the degrees of self-surrender, this is fana, ascend unto the kingdom of life everlasting, this is baqa, and without partaking from the wellspring of utter abnegation, quaff the wine of the Ancient of Days. These souls, as they traverse the stages of wayfaring and ascend unto the stations of reunion, walk a different path and occupy a different rank. So he's contrasting the first paragraph, which is one could see it as the narrative of the seven valleys, getting through to annihilation and then beyond to eternal life. He says, well, one can also basically not even have to traverse that stage of annihilation, but just land straight on the goal. Which is this goal of life everlasting, and Baha'u'llah seems to be suggesting the same thing in the Seven Valleys itself. In paragraph 87 of the Seven Valleys, after describing the journeys all the way up to the stage of self-annihilation, he says, but the detached wayfarer may traverse these 7 stages in 7 steps, nay, rather in 7 breaths. Nay, even in a single breath, should God will and desire it. So we remember that from the Seven Valleys. Baha'u'llah had already mentioned that sort of option that you can either traverse all the valleys in the usual sequence, or it's possible to traverse them all in one breath. So
that's by the will of God, right?
By the will of God, and that's exactly the point. That this paragraph 2, sort of the standard narrative, Baha'u'llah says, is the uttermost limit in the realm of effort and striving. So that's sort of through your own efforts, that's the best you can do. But this next, paragraph 3, where he's saying, straight to the end, that's really not up to us. If it's more a matter of grace than our own effort. If that's the journey that we take to sort of just get all the way to the end.
We should be careful though when we think about God's will, because we often think of it as almost arbitrary. The way that the Jews thought about God as being an angry God, a difficult God, a mysterious, one that cannot be understood, and therefore arbitrary almost. Actually, God's will here is to have this diversity. That is what God's will truly is, and so
diversity of the different places in the valley.
Right, and for each individual to traverse different paths and to exceed different limits and so forth. God's will is not just. We think of God as playing favorites. Oh, this one, I'm going to bless this one, and I'm not going to bless that one. It's really not about that. From God, if I may try to attempt God's perspective here, which is really very egotistical of me, isn't it? But it just seems to me that from a God perspective, God, want this diversity. I want all of these different paths to be followed. Because that's how unity, how the greater result that is at the God level will occur, will come to pass because of that diversity.
My understanding of what you're saying is the simply put idea that God gave us all free will.
But God has a purpose in that. It's
That's
not just
right.
for fun or for us.
In giving us free will, God supports us in our choices, and it determines how we grow in terms of our own spiritual consciousness at different rates and different ways.
So let's look.
It may not be determined. It's an interesting. It leads to some interesting possibilities.
But I do know that they talk about people who became a Baha'i that there's been some deed. Some deed that helped us to recognize Baha'u'llah. Is that true? Have you heard that?
Yeah.
There's something.
Yeah, I've seen something like that. I can't off the top of my head
One can never look
quote
back
it.
and say, well, that was the good thing I did.
Yeah. It's not that
because you said there's nothing we can do. Certainly our intention or have some sort of effect, if that's what Baha'u'llah did say.
Yeah. Well, there's a third valley, which is even beyond these, and now we're like well beyond the 7 valleys. This is the really let's say the advanced stuff, which is a mode of spiritual approach that is beyond names and attributes, and which of course means it's impossible to describe, but Baha'u'llah just gives it a shot anyway. In this beautiful paragraph, he describes it. And this paragraph, I think, is analogous to a similar paragraph in Gems of Divine Mysteries. The final paragraph in Gems of Divine Mysteries is this stage that Baha'u'llah is describing. And I'll read this paragraph and then that paragraph from Gems of Divine Mysteries. He says, still others, without having perused a single letter of the kingdom of names, or acquired the faintest intimation from the realm of attributes, which pertain to this world, dawn above the invisible horizon of eternity, and return again thereunto. 100,000 seas of glory surge in their luminous hearts, and yet to outward seeming their lips are parched. A myriad rivers of holiness stream within their breasts, and yet no trace thereof is to be seen. The books of God's consummate wisdom are recorded upon the tablets of their hearts, and yet they breathe not a word thereof in the world of appearances. They dwell in the Egypt of certitude, and journey in the lands of resignation. They are intoxicated with the beauty and entranced by the glory of him who is the all-glorious. Heart to heart they whisper hidden secrets. Soul to soul they unfold abstruse matters. The mysteries of the divine essence glow upon their brows, and the lights of divine unity shine from their peerless faces. They clothe themselves in the robe of concealment, and cast their sleeves over both this world and the world to come. Without wings they soar, without feet they walk, without hands they grasp and hold. They speak an unknown tongue and observe an unseen grammar, of which all the world's inhabitants know not a single letter, save those whom thy Lord hath willed. Unto each hath a share been vouchsafed in his book, and they shall all attain unto that which hath been destined for them.
That sounds pretty good.
It sounds pretty good, yeah. That's on pages 59 to 60. That's paragraph 4 of this third tablet. Now compare that to how Baha'u'llah, in far fewer words, describes the final valley in Gems of Divine Mysteries. He says, from this station, and this is the station, actually, similarly in Gems of Divine Mysteries, it goes from annihilation to Baqa, to eternal life, to this third valley, which has no name or description. So that exactly, Baqa, yeah, is eternal, life eternal. And so the three stages, the three last valleys in Gems of Divine Mysteries, maps onto these three stages that Baha'u'llah is describing in this third tablet. That final valley in Gems of Divine Mysteries goes like this. From this station the wayfarer ascendeth unto a city that hath no name or description, and whereof one heareth neither sound nor mention. Therein flow the oceans of eternity, whilst this city itself revolveth round the seat of eternity. Therein the sun of the unseen shineth resplendent above the horizon of the unseen, a sun that hath its own heavens and its own moons, which partake of its light, and which rise from and set upon the ocean of the unseen. Nor can I ever hope to impart even a dewdrop of that which hath been decreed therein, as none is acquainted with its mysteries save God, its creator and fashioner, and his manifestations. And the word for the unseen here. And his manifestations, yes.
Maybe that's the world of the manifestation.
Perhaps he's describing a level inaccessible to normal human consciousness.
Maybe.
And I think there might be, but the word here for unseen, ghaib, is the same word for unseen that Baha'u'llah refers to also in the fourth paragraph, where he talks about the invisible horizon of eternity. So there's also similarity of terminology that Baha'u'llah is using. So I think
the
there's
invisible, there's actually unseen.
yes, it's invisible in one and it's unseen in the other. It's the word ghaib, yeah.
It's the same actual word.
It's the same actual word, yeah.
What is it?
Ghaib. It's Ghayb. So it sounds like Baha'u'llah is there's some consistency in how Baha'u'llah is describing these later stages, and the consistent idea is that it becomes progressively more and more abstract until in the later stages one is transcending even the concept of valleys almost. Because names and attributes dissolve in a kind of oneness which is impossible to really put in words. Although he does. He says it has its own sun and it sets on its own sea, and the residents speak its own grammar. But all of this is to say that there are those, and perhaps that is confined to the prophets. Perhaps only once in many generations does a person arise who has this level of consciousness or awareness.
Mankind is very old.
That's right. So there
evolved, and there have always been, Baha'u'llah said there always have been manifestations.
And so there are and as Baha'u'llah himself says also, there have been countless manifestations into the past. And
I'd say mankind is very young, but I don't know.
So,
but there have been many manifestations.
So after describing these three different grades, and after affirming actually in the fifth paragraph, I won't read this long paragraph, affirming the station of the Bab, and that clearly situates this as a tablet that was revealed before Baha'u'llah's own declaration. He goes on and says something I think so key to not just our understanding of the mystical path, but our understanding of Baha'u'llah's practical, social, and pragmatic solution for human unity. And that's encapsulated in paragraphs 6 and 7. He says, "But since all do not possess the same degree of spiritual understanding, certain statements will inevitably be made, and there shall arise, as a consequence, as many differing opinions as there are human minds, and as many divergent beliefs as there are created things. This is certain and settled, and can in no wise be averted. Now it is clear that some are virtuous, others are sinful, and still others are rebellious. One must call the people to love and faithfulness, to zeal and contentment, that the sinful may be admonished, and the ranks of the virtuous may swell. Nor is it possible that there be no sinners, so long as the name, the ever-forgiving, shineth resplendent above the horizon of existence. There will be sinners in the world of creation, for the latter cannot appear without the former, and the former cannot exist without the latter. Our aim is that thou shouldst urge all the believers to show forth kindness and mercy, and to overlook certain shortcomings among them, that differences may be dispelled, true harmony be established, and the censure and reproach, the hatred and dissension seen among the peoples of former times may not arise anew. Perchance they may be educated, and in the latter resurrection inflict not upon that cherished spirit and essence of existence," he's referring to himself now, of course, "that exalted and subtle reality, the least of that which the point of the bayan was made to suffer." So this talk about, there's sinners and there's, rebellious ones. Of course, that's all relative, as he describes in Gems of Divine Mysteries and elsewhere. Who is a sinner depends on what valley you're in. The good deeds of the righteous are the sins of the near ones. And it's because of that, our whole idea of, well, you're following an unspiritual path or a sinful or rebellious path is maybe true from one perspective, but from another perspective, that path of rebellion is actually a spiritual path in its own right. And if we really understand that, suddenly we have a degree of tolerance that we never could have had before. And I think this is the kind of tolerance that Baha'u'llah is calling us to. Be kind to others. Recognize that there are all these different paths that you actually consider as wrong or sinful, but know that they might be thinking the same thing of you. And which is obviously, this is to put it in words is one thing. To live this is another thing. To actually live this in a community where you're a small little community, and every action of every person has a big effect on that community. And wouldn't it be easier if everyone just thought of things the same way? Wouldn't it be easier if everyone, lived the same way and valued things, in exactly the same way? But that's not how it wouldn't just be boring. But that's not just how things are. That's not the human condition. That's not the state of the human reality.
It's not reality.
And whereas the easy way out for any religion is to only attract like-minded people, because and then of course that sets up an us and them. You've created your own bubble of people who all tend to think in the same way, And then naturally that's going to exclude everyone else who doesn't tend to think in that same way. And Baha'u'llah is asking us to do something far more difficult and challenging, which is to create a viable religious community, which a viable, a real functioning religious community in which it is embracing, accepting, and validating all of these different spiritual paths, but doing so within the umbrella of a single organization that actually is able to coherently act and is able to bring justice and love into the world, and a higher degree of order into the world, but to do so in a way that doesn't efface these necessary distinctions on the spiritual level. Let me just finish, and then we can open it up. So just to finish this tablet, then Baha'u'llah concludes with a few words to his questioner, and this is paragraph 8. Apparently, the questioner was asking, well, what about the commandments? Because that's the next question you ask. Well, it's one thing to have this degree of tolerance for people who have different theological viewpoints, who look at the world through these different spiritual lenses, eye of unity and eye of distinction. It's abstract enough that you can imagine people getting along just fine, even though they have these very different theological beliefs. But when it comes to, okay, what do you do? What's forbidden and what's permissible within this community? What are your laws and what's, because there you have actual differences which you can't get around those differences by just saying, well, we're all going to get along and work through these differences of perspective. When it comes to actually, the do's and don'ts, you now have a real pragmatic problem. And Baha'u'llah is addressing this kind of obliquely in the last couple of paragraphs of this tablet, basically by saying the time for this is premature. It's almost as though the questioner was asking him, to enumerate these or to comment on, the forbidden and the permissible. And Baha'u'llah basically says, now isn't really the time for that. He says, moreover, a reply to thine enquiries was sent aforetime. It is evident that whatever question is asked will be answered through the ocean of eternal grace, but such questions also add to the burden of duties imposed upon the servants. That which hath been recorded at God's behest in the Persian Bayan is indeed sufficient unto all, and none will be held to account for that which it hath not commanded. Consider how numerous were those who in the early days of the revelation, who obeyed without the slightest deviation every least one of its injunctions, and yet reaped no benefit therefrom. The beginning of religion is love for God and for his chosen ones, and its end is to manifest that love to his servants. Completely out of the question of, separate from this question of
the beginning of religion
injunction.
is to love God.
And the end is to manifest that love to his servants. Sums it up so beautifully. I swear by God, he says, whoso faileth to obey the commandments of God can in no wise be numbered among his loved ones. For among the conditions of his love is to follow his commandments and observe his prohibitions. But since these are the days of concealment, and the Son of Eternity remaineth hidden beneath the horizon of being, one must gather together everyone with love and protect them. The time for the contemplation of the completion of the commandments and the perfection of deeds will assuredly come.